The Georgia sun in the summer of 1943 was a cruel, relentless thing. It beat down on the red clay of Fort Benning, turning the air into a thick, wet blanket that clung to the skin and made every breath a chore. For the men of the 4th Armored Division's motor pool, it was just another misery to be endured. Like the biting flies, the bland food, and the constant, grinding work of keeping their machines ready for a war an ocean away. Into this world of sweat, grease, and masculine pride walked Eleanor Vance. She wasn't tall or imposing, but she moved with a quiet confidence that came from a life spent on a Texas ranch, where complaining was a luxury no one could afford. Her hair was tied back tightly beneath her service cap, and her Women's Army Corps uniform, though practical, looked out of place in the sea of men's fatigues. Her hands, clean but for a few faint scars on the knuckles, looked like they had seen their share of hard work. She reported for duty to Master Sergeant Frank Rizzo, a man who seemed to be carved from the same tough, unforgiving gristle as the old tires stacked behind the workshop. He had a face like a crumpled map, with lines etched by the North African sun and a permanent scowl that seemed to dare the world to challenge him. He took the transfer papers from Ellie without looking at her, his eyes scanning the page with a bored indifference. "Vance, Eleanor," he grunted, finally looking up. His eyes, small and dark, raked over her from head to toe. A smirk played on his lips. "A whack in my motor pool. Is this some kind of joke?" A few of the younger mechanics nearby snickered. Ellie's jaw tightened, but her voice was steady when she replied. "No, Master Sergeant. I'm a certified mechanic. I'm here to work." Rizzo let out a short, humorless laugh. "A mechanic? Lady, the only thing you'll be fixing around here is coffee. Patton's men don't include dames. This is a motor pool, not a social club." He turned away, dismissing her. "Corporal," he barked at a lanky young man, "find something for our guest to do, something that won't get her pretty hands dirty." The message was clear. She was an outsider, an unwelcome novelty. The men treated her like a ghost, sometimes walking right past her as if she weren't there. Other times whispering and laughing just loud enough for her to hear. They called her Patton's pet or General Eleanor. The injustice of it burned in her chest, a hot, angry coal. She hadn't joined the WACs to be a punchline. Her older brother Tom had died at Pearl Harbor. His last letter home had been full of pride for his country and his duty. Ellie had joined to honor him, to do her part, to use the skills her father had taught her fixing tractors and trucks on their ranch. She knew engines. She knew the satisfying heft of a wrench and the logic of a firing order. Her first assignment was to clean the grease trap, a filthy, thankless job usually reserved for punishing recruits. She didn't say a word. She put on a pair of overalls, tied a rag around her face, and went to work. For 2 days, she scraped and scrubbed, her muscles aching and her senses assaulted by the foul stench. When she was done, the trap was cleaner than it had been in years. Rizzo didn't even glance at it. Next, they had her sorting bolts and spark plugs, a mind-numbing task meant to bore her into quitting. She organized the entire supply shed, creating a labeling system that was so simple and effective that even the most disorganized mechanic could find what he needed in seconds. They grumbled that they couldn't find anything anymore, even though it was right in front of them. Her crucible, however, came in the form of a Jeep. It sat behind the main garage, a sad, rusted thing that had been cannibalized for parts. It had no engine block, 2 flat tires, and weeds growing up through the floorboards. The men called it the pile. Rizzo pointed at it one morning, a malicious glint in his eye. "All right, a mechanic," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. "You want to work? Get that running." The men erupted in laughter. It was an impossible task. The Jeep was scrap metal, a carcass. It was his final grand insult, designed to break her spirit completely. Ellie simply looked at the Jeep, then back at Rizzo. "Yes, Master Sergeant," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. For the next 2 weeks, the pile became her world. During the day, she did the menial tasks they assigned her, sweeping floors and washing parts. But at night, when the rest of the motor pool was in the barracks playing cards or sleeping, Ellie was under the stars with her broken-down Jeep. The workshop was locked, so she worked with her own small set of tools and a single lantern. She became a scavenger, She traded a pack of cigarettes to a supply clerk for a cracked but usable engine block. She found a working carburetor in a scrap heap. She spent hours patching the tires, her fingers raw and sore. The work was slow and frustrating. More than once, she wanted to scream, to throw her wrench into the darkness and give up. But then she would think of her brother Tom, of the quiet pride in her father's eyes when she had first fixed their family's truck all by herself. She thought of Rizzo's smug face, and the anger returned, hardening into pure, unyielding determination. The men watched her with amusement at first, placing bets on which day she would finally quit. $1 said she wouldn't last the week. $5 said she'd be in tears by Friday. But as the days turned into a week and then two, the amusement began to fade, replaced by a grudging curiosity. They saw her in the evenings, a lone figure working under a faint yellow light, her face smudged with grease, her hands never still. She never asked for help. She never complained. One night, a young lieutenant named Miller, a quiet, observant man fresh out of officer training, was walking back to his quarters late. He heard a strange noise coming from behind the workshop, a cough, a sputter, and then a low, rumbling growl. He followed the sound and saw it. The pile was running. Its engine turned over with a rough but steady rhythm, its one working headlight cutting a bright line through the darkness. Ellie was in the driver's seat, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights. She was covered in grease, her uniform was stained, and she looked utterly exhausted. But on her face was a smile of pure, triumphant satisfaction. The next morning, the motor pool was abuzz. The men gathered around the Jeep, staring in disbelief. It was ugly, patched together, and loud, but it was alive. Rizzo came out of his office, his face a thundercloud. He walked around the Jeep, kicking one of the newly patched tires. He looked at Ellie, who stood waiting, her arms crossed. He was searching for an insult, a way to diminish her achievement, but for once, he seemed at a loss for words. Before he could speak, Lieutenant Miller stepped forward, his expression firm. "Master Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying across the yard, "I saw Sergeant Vance working on this vehicle. She did it on her own time with scrounged parts. That's the kind of initiative General Patton asks for." Rizzo's jaw clenched. He was outranked. Just then a clerk ran out of the office waving a piece of paper. "Orders are in!" he shouted. "We're shipping out! We're heading for England in 2 weeks." A cheer went up from the men. The air was electric with excitement and fear. This was it. The real thing. Later that day, Rizzo found Ellie checking the fluids in a transport truck. "Vance," he said, his voice low, "don't get any ideas. You're not coming with us. The front is no place for a woman. You'll be transferred to a desk job in London. I'm putting in the request myself." Ellie's heart sank. After all her work, after proving herself, he was still going to push her aside. The injustice felt like a physical blow. "That's not your decision, Master Sergeant," a voice said from behind them. It was Lieutenant Miller. "I've already cleared it with the captain. Sergeant Vance's skills are essential. She's on the deployment roster. She's going to France with the rest of us." Miller gave Ellie a small, encouraging nod and walked away. Ellie looked at Rizzo. The hatred in his eyes was cold and sharp. He hadn't been trying to protect her. He had been trying to get rid of her, and he had failed. The bet was over. The joke had run its course. But for Ellie, the fight was just beginning. She was going to war, not just with the Germans, but with the very men she was supposed to serve alongside. The crossing to England was rough, and the weeks spent there were a blur of final preparations, nervous energy, and endless drizzling rain. For Ellie, it was an uneasy truce. The men in the motor pool no longer openly mocked her, but they kept their distance, forming a silent, unwelcoming wall. Rizzo ignored her completely, assigning her duties through a corporal, his eyes sliding past her as if she were a piece of equipment. Only Lieutenant Miller treated her as an equal, often stopping by to discuss the mechanical readiness of their vehicles, his questions sharp and his respect genuine. Then came Normandy. They landed on Utah Beach weeks after the initial invasion, but the scars of the battle were everywhere. The landscape was a mangled ruin of shattered trees, flooded fields, and the rusting skeletons of landing craft impaled on the sand. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the ghosts of the men who had fought and died there. The romantic notions of war, if Ellie had ever held any, were stripped away by the grim reality of it all. This wasn't a noble adventure. It was a world of mud, fear, and the constant thrumming presence of death. The 4th Armored Division was part of General Patton's 3rd Army, and their mission was speed. They were the tip of the spear in Operation Cobra, the plan to break out of the Normandy hedgerows and race across France. For the motor pool, this meant a relentless, brutal pace. Sleep was a luxury, measured in minutes snatched in the back of a truck. Meals were cold rations eaten on the move, and the work was unending. The hedgerows, thick, ancient walls of earth and tangled roots, were a nightmare for their vehicles. Tanks threw their tracks, trucks snapped their axles, and jeeps sank to their frames in the ever-present mud. Ellie worked until her muscles screamed and her hands were numb. She learned to diagnose an engine by its sound, to work by the faint glow of a hooded flashlight while the sky flickered with distant artillery. The war became a series of visceral snapshots. The hollow-eyed faces of infantrymen trudging past their convoy. The sudden, terrifying whistle of an incoming shell. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with the sweet, sickening scent of decay. The sight of a French child standing in the doorway of a ruined house, her expression blank and old. It was during a push towards Avranches that Ellie's moment came. Their convoy was moving down a narrow, muddy lane, flanked by tall hedgerows that made them feel like they were in a tunnel. It had been raining for 3 days straight, and the road was a river of thick, brown sludge. Suddenly, the lead supply truck, a big 2.5-ton GMC loaded with critical mortar ammunition, lurched violently and sank into the mud. There was a sharp crack like a rifle shot, and the truck groaned to a halt, its rear axle snapped clean in two. The entire column was blocked. They were exposed, a perfect target for German artillery. The men started shouting, their voices tight with panic. Rizzo ran forward, took one look at the crippled truck, and cursed. "It's a lost cause!" he yelled over the sound of the rain. "The axle's gone? Get a detail and unload the ammo. We'll have to abandon the truck and drag it off the road." Abandoning the truck would take hours they didn't have. Every man there knew it. They could hear the faint, ominous crump of German mortars, seemingly getting closer. Ellie pushed her way through the knot of anxious soldiers. She slid under the truck, ignoring the cold mud that soaked through her fatigues. The axle was indeed snapped, a jagged break in the thick steel. It was an impossible fix, not here, not with the tools they had. But as she lay there, the smell of the wet earth reminding her of spring planting back in Texas, she remembered something her father had done years ago. A piece of harvesting equipment had broken in a similar way, miles from the barn, with a storm rolling in. Her father, a man who could fix anything with baling wire and sheer stubbornness, had refused to give up. She crawled out from under the truck, her mind racing. "Give me the heavy winch chain from the recovery vehicle," she ordered a nearby private. "And a long steel pry bar." Rizzo glared at her. "Vance, what in God's name do you think you're doing? I gave an order. Unload the truck." "There's no time, Sergeant," she shot back, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "Just get me the chain." Perhaps it was the urgency of the situation, or the flicker of desperation in their eyes. But the men moved. They brought her the thick, greasy chain and the heavy pry bar. Under her direction, they looped the chain around the two broken ends of the axle, pulling it as tight as they could. Then, she had two of the strongest men use the pry bar as a tensioning lever, twisting the chain until it bit into the steel, forcing the two pieces of the axle together. It was a crude, brutal solution. The chain acted like a splint, held in place by immense pressure. "It won't hold for long," she said, her breath coming in ragged gasps from the effort. "But it might hold long enough to get us out of this ditch and off the road." The truck's driver, a young man with fear in his eyes, climbed back into the cab. "Easy," Ellie told him. "Slow and steady. Don't jerk it." The engine roared to life. The wheels spun, throwing mud everywhere. The truck groaned and shuddered. The chain creaked under the strain, the metal links screaming in protest. Every man held his breath, waiting for the telltale snap of failure. But it held. Inch by agonizing inch, the heavy truck pulled itself out of the mud and onto firmer ground. A ragged, spontaneous cheer went up from the men. They had saved the truck, and more importantly, they had saved the precious minutes that might be the difference between life and death. They managed to limp to a clearing a few miles down the road, where they could properly transfer the ammunition and tow the disabled vehicle. As Ellie cleaned the mud and grease from her hands with a gasoline-soaked rag, a few of the younger soldiers approached her. "That was something else, Sergeant Vance," one of them said, a genuine look of awe on his face. "Never seen anything like it." "My dad taught me," she said with a small, weary smile. It was the first time any of them had spoken to her with anything that resembled respect. It was a small victory, but it felt immense. Rizzo saw the exchange. He stood by a jeep, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had seen what she had done. He had seen the men's reaction. But he said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, his silence a heavier judgment than any of his insults had ever been. Lieutenant Miller, however, did not remain silent. He came over to her, his own uniform splattered with mud. "Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "What you did back there was extraordinary. You saved a vital piece of equipment, and you kept this column moving. I'm writing you up for a commendation." Ellie was too tired to feel much of anything. "I was just doing my job, sir." "No," Miller corrected her gently. "You did more than your job. You led. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." His words were a balm on the raw wounds of the past few months. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally being seen for who she was. A few days later, their rapid advance continued. Patton's orders were simple: move fast, hit hard, and don't stop. They were racing towards the heart of France. The Germans were retreating, but they were not broken. They fought with a savage cunning, leaving traps and ambushes for the advancing Americans. Their column was rolling through the outskirts of a small, war-torn village when it happened. The world exploded in a deafening roar. The lead Sherman tank, just 50 yards ahead of Ellie's maintenance jeep, erupted in a ball of fire and black smoke. It slewed sideways, its track shattered, blocking the road. Immediately, machine gun. Fire ripped through the air from a ruined stone building on their right. A hidden German anti-tank gun. An ambush. Men dove for cover, scrambling into ditches and behind the stalled vehicles. Ellie flattened herself against the ground, the dirt vibrating from the force of the explosions. She saw Lieutenant Miller, who had been riding near the front, get thrown by the blast. He lay still in a ditch by the side of the road, half hidden by weeds. The men were pinned down. The German gun, a dreaded 88, had a clear line of sight down the entire column. They were trapped, caught in a perfectly executed ambush. The Germans no longer thought they were a joke, and now Patton's men were about to bleed. Chaos was a living thing. It was the screaming of wounded men, the relentless, deafening chatter of the German machine gun, and the terrifying whoosh of the anti-tank gun reloading. The air tasted of cordite and fear. The men of the motor pool, mechanics and drivers, were not frontline infantry. They were pinned down, their faces pressed into the dirt, paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming violence. Rizzo, his face pale but his eyes blazing with a veteran's fury, was trying to rally them. "Get some covering fire on that building," he bellowed, his voice nearly lost in the din. "Someone get the bazooka!" But it was hopeless. The German 88 was too well protected, nestled inside the ground floor of a destroyed stone farmhouse. Any man who raised his head was met with a hail of bullets. They were sitting ducks, a column of steel coffins waiting to be picked off one by one. Ellie watched in horror. Her mind, usually so clear and logical, was a whirlwind of panic. Then through the smoke she saw a flicker of movement in the ditch. It was Lieutenant Miller. He was trying to crawl, dragging a leg that was bent at an unnatural angle. He was alive, but he was exposed, right in the line of fire. Something inside Ellie snapped. The fear didn't vanish, but it was shoved aside by a cold, sharp clarity. She thought of the maps Lieutenant Miller was always studying, the ones he would spread over the hood of his Jeep every night, memorizing every road, every creek, every stone wall. He'd pointed out this very village to her just yesterday. Bad spot, he'd said. A natural choke point. Perfect for an ambush. She knew this ground. And in that instant, she saw a path. Behind her, parked precariously close to a ruined barn, was a familiar, ugly silhouette. It was the Pile, the rusty, dilapidated Jeep she had brought back from the dead at Fort Benning. It had been towed across the ocean and dragged across France, a rolling monument to her stubbornness. The men had wanted to leave it behind a dozen times, but Miller had insisted it come along, calling it their good luck charm. An idea, wild and desperate, flashed in her mind. It was a crazy suicidal plan. It was a joke. And that's why it just might work. She crawled over to a young private named Jimmy, a boy from Ohio who couldn't have been more than 18. He was a good kid who had shared his chocolate ration with her a few days before. He was now weeping silently, his rifle clutched in a white-knuckled grip. "Jimmy?" she said, her voice low and urgent, practically yelling to be heard over the noise. "I need you to listen to me. I need you to lay down fire on the second-floor window of that farmhouse. Don't stop, no matter what. Can you do that?" He looked at her, his eyes wide with terror. "They'll kill me! They'll kill us all if we just lay here," she said, grabbing his shoulder. "I have a plan. I need a distraction. I need you to be brave for 30 seconds. Can you do that for me, Jimmy?" He stared at her for a long moment, then a flicker of resolve hardened his features. He nodded, wiping the tears from his face with a muddy sleeve. "Okay, Sergeant," he whispered. "Okay." While Jimmy started firing his M1 Garand in short, controlled bursts at the farmhouse, Ellie scrambled back towards the barn. She grabbed 2 grenades from the belt of a wounded man and a satchel charge from a nearby half-track. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a drum counting down her final seconds. She reached the Pile. The keys were still in the ignition, a habit born of the need for a quick getaway. She climbed in, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. "Come on, you old piece of junk," she whispered, her voice choked with desperation. "Not now. Please, not now." She tried again. The engine caught, roaring to life with the familiar, unhealthy rattle she knew so well. Keeping her body low, she reached down and wedged a rock against the accelerator pedal, pushing it down hard. The engine screamed in protest. Then came the trickiest part. She grabbed a length of rope from the back, tied one end to the steering wheel, and looped the other end around the door frame. By pulling the rope, she could hold the wheels straight for a few crucial seconds before letting go. She took a deep breath. She yelled to Jimmy, "Now, son! Give 'em hell!" Jimmy popped up from his cover and fired as fast as he could, the ping of his empty clips echoing in the chaos. At the same time, Ellie put the Jeep in gear, pulled the rope tight to straighten the wheel, and rolled out of the driver's seat. Hitting the ground hard, the Pile, her resurrected ghost, shot out from behind the barn. It was a ridiculous, terrifying sight. A driverless Jeep, its engine shrieking, rattling, and backfiring, careened down a narrow side alley that opened up onto the flank of the German position. It wasn't a charge. It was a mechanical comedy of errors. For a moment, the German gunners were completely baffled. What was this? Some kind of trick? A lone empty Jeep making a suicidal run? Their machine gun, which had been methodically stitching lines of death across the American position, faltered. The massive barrel of the .88 began to swing around, tracking the bizarre new threat. It was the opening Ellie needed. 2 seconds. That was the window they gave her. She burst from cover, sprinting across the open ground, her legs pumping, her lungs burning. The world narrowed to a single point, the stone wall of the farmhouse. Bullets from the German riflemen on the second floor kicked up dirt around her feet. But the main guns were still distracted by the ghost in the machine. The pile. Its journey ending, smashed into a stone wall 50 yards from the German gun, the sound of the impact lost in the wider noise of battle. But it had done its job. Ellie reached the blind spot beneath the 88's cannon. She pulled the pin on the first grenade, counted to 2, and tossed it through the large, blown-out opening where the gun was nested. She didn't wait to see it explode. She pulled the pin on the second and threw it right after. Then she activated the satchel charge and shoved it against the stone foundation of the building. She turned and ran. The world dissolved into a white-hot flash and a deafening roar that felt like it tore the air in two. The force of the blast threw her forward, and she landed hard, skidding through the mud and debris. Her ears were ringing, and for a moment she couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched whine. Slowly, the sounds of the world returned. But something was different. The heavy, thudding report of the 88 was gone. The relentless chatter of the machine gun had fallen silent. The only sounds were the crackle of flames, the groans of the wounded and the first, hesitant shouts of the American soldiers. The ambush was broken. Men were getting to their feet, staring in stunned silence at the smoking ruin of the German position. Ellie pushed herself up. Her body ached, and she had a deep gash on her forehead, but she was alive. She and Jimmy, who had survived his brave stand, ran to the ditch where Lieutenant Miller lay. They carefully dragged him back to the relative safety of a disabled truck. His leg was bad, but he was conscious. As they were trying to apply a tourniquet, a group of soldiers carried Master Sergeant Rizzo over. His face was gray with pain. He had taken a piece of shrapnel to his thigh, and blood was soaking through his trousers. They laid him down next to the lieutenant. His eyes, clouded with pain, found Ellie's. He looked at her, then at the wreckage of the German gun, then back to her. The usual sneer, the mockery, the disdain, it was all gone. In its place was something she had never seen before. A look of raw, absolute dumbfounded disbelief. The woman he had dismissed as a joke, the mechanic he had tried to get rid of, had just single-handedly saved their entire unit. She hadn't just fixed a machine. She had weaponized it. The ghost she had built in the quiet nights of Fort Benning had just become the angel of their deliverance. And for Frank Rizzo, the world had just been turned completely upside down. The aftermath of the ambush was a blur of organized chaos. Medics moved among the wounded, their voices calm and steady amidst the groans of pain. A new commanding officer, a captain pulled from a supporting role, began barking orders, restoring a sense of structure to the shattered column. The threat was gone, but the cost was etched on the faces of the survivors. Lieutenant Miller was among the first to be evacuated. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, he grabbed Ellie's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Vance!" he rasped, his face tight with pain. "You tell them. You make sure the captain knows exactly what you did." "Don't worry, sir," she said softly. "Just get yourself well." Rizzo was also prepped for evacuation to a field hospital. His wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was deep enough to take him out of the fight for a while. As the medics worked on him, he kept looking at Ellie. The stunned disbelief had been replaced by a heavy, somber silence. He was a man wrestling with a reality he had refused to accept. A few hours later, in the relative quiet of a temporary aid station set up in the village church, Ellie found herself sitting across from him. They were waiting for transport to a more established hospital behind the lines. The air smelled of antiseptic and old stone. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Rizzo cleared his throat, a rough, gravelly sound. "Vance," he began, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the dirty bandage wrapped around his thigh. "What you did back there?" He trailed off, struggling with the words. "You did good. Real good." It wasn't a grand apology, but coming from him, it was more significant than a parade. "We all did what we had to do," Ellie replied quietly. He finally looked at her, and for the first time she saw something beyond the cynicism and the anger. She saw a deep, weary sadness. "I had a friend," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Back in North Africa. Best damn mechanic I ever knew. Name was Charlie. He could make a tank engine sing. One day we were under fire, and a fuel line on my half-track got hit. I was a cocky sergeant back then, thought I knew everything. I told him it was just a small leak, to patch it quick so we could move. He said we needed to stop, to do it right. But I pushed him. I told him to hurry. A German shell landed 50 yards away. The concussion was just enough to make that patched line spray fuel all over the hot engine. He was gone before I could even pull him out. He stared at his hands, his knuckles white. I lost my nerve that day, Vance. Not for fighting, but for responsibility. For having people's lives in my hands. Every time I looked at one of my men, I saw Charlie. When you showed up, a woman, I just saw another person I could fail. Another person who could get killed because of me. It was easier to push you away, to pretend you didn't belong, than to add you to that list. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a reason. Ellie didn't know what to say. She just nodded, acknowledging the confession of a broken man. The price of his experience had been his hope. When Ellie returned to the motor pool a day later, everything had changed. The wall of silence was gone. The whispers and sideways glances had been replaced by nods of respect. The men no longer saw a dame trying to play soldier. They saw Sergeant Vance, the woman who ran into the fire while they were all pinned to the ground. "Hey, Sarge," a young mechanic said as she approached. "Corporal wants to know if you can take a look at the transmission on number 3. It's grinding in second gear." Sarge. They called her Sarge. The respect was real, earned not with words but with courage. She had paid for it with blood, sweat, and a fear so profound she could still taste it. It was a heavy price. But as she went to work on the transmission, a wrench in her hand feeling as natural as breathing, she knew it was worth it. The war, however, did not wait for personal victories. The race across France continued, a brutal, grinding advance. Summer faded into a wet, miserable autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. They pushed east, towards the German border, towards the promise of an end to the fighting. Then came the Ardennes. The world turned white and frozen. The snow came down in thick, wet flakes, blanketing the forest and turning the roads into treacherous paths of ice and mud. It was the coldest winter in decades, and the men were miserable. But for the motor pool, it was a special kind of hell. Engines refused to start. Fuel lines froze solid. Oil turned to sludge. Ellie worked tirelessly, her face chapped and raw from the wind, her fingers so cold she often lost feeling in them. She became the heart of the unit's mechanical operations, her knowledge and ingenuity keeping their vehicles moving when all logic said they should be frozen lumps of steel. The men now relied on her, not just for her skills, but for her quiet, unshakable strength. She had seen the worst of the war, and she was still standing, still working, still pushing forward. Her resilience became their resilience. But the cold and the work were not the worst parts. The fighting in the Ardennes forest was close, savage, and terrifying. The Germans, in a last, desperate offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, threw everything they had at the American lines. It was during a fierce, confusing skirmish in the dense, snow-laden woods that they lost Private Jimmy, the boy from Ohio. He was killed by a sniper, a single clean shot. Ellie helped carry his body back to their lines, her tears freezing on her cheeks. She remembered his terrified face in the ambush and the courage he had found. The injustice of his death, so young and so far from home, was a heavy weight on her soul. The war gave respect with one hand and snatched away life with the other. A few days later, during a counterattack, they managed to overrun a German command post. In the chaos, they captured several prisoners, including a high-ranking SS officer. He was arrogant and defiant, even in defeat. While the officer was being interrogated, Ellie was tasked with sorting through the documents and personal effects found in the command post. She was methodical, placing maps in one pile, code books in another. Then she came across a worn leather satchel. Inside, among personal letters and a few photographs of a smiling woman and children, was a small stack of reconnaissance photos. Her blood ran cold. They were pictures of Fort Benning, Georgia. She flipped through them, her heart pounding. There were photos of the barracks, the training grounds, and the main gate. And then she saw it. A crystal-clear picture of their motor pool. She could see the trucks lined up, the workshop, and even the rusted, forgotten shape of the pile behind the barn. She turned the photo over. On the back, written in neat, precise German script, was a short note. Ellie's grandparents had been German immigrants, and she had picked up a little of the language as a child. She could only read a few words, simple things her grandmother used to say. But she could read enough to make out the date. June 1943, just before she had arrived at the motor pool. And she could read one other word, a name that made the air freeze in her lungs. Rizzo. The name seemed to burn on the back of the photograph. Rizzo. Why would his name be in a German intelligence officer's possession on a photo taken at their training base in Georgia? 100 fragmented moments suddenly clicked into place in Ellie's mind, forming a deeply disturbing picture. Rizzo's relentless hostility, his almost pathological need to get rid of her, his specific comment at the front was, "No place for a woman." It had felt like prejudice, like the bitter cynicism of a broken man. But what if it was something more? She had to know for sure. Taking the photo, she found a sergeant from G2 Army Intelligence, a man who spoke fluent German. She told him she'd found it among the captured documents and asked him what the note said. The intelligence sergeant studied the photograph, his brow furrowed. He read the German script aloud, translating as he went. Target unit is mechanically sound, but morale is fragile. Master Sergeant Rizzo is the weak link. Potential asset. The woman... He paused, squinting at the next word. The woman is the distraction. The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. Rizzo is the weak link. The woman is the distraction. It wasn't that Rizzo thought she was a joke. It was that he needed her to be a joke. He hadn't been trying to undermine her because he thought she was incompetent. He had been trying to get her removed because her competence, her very presence, was a threat to a plan she couldn't begin to understand. The constant insults, the impossible tasks. It was all a calculated effort to make her fail, to make her quit, to get her transferred. He wasn't just being a chauvinist. He was actively sabotaging her career for a reason that had nothing to do with her gender and everything to do with a secret he was hiding. Just then, a jeep pulled up. Master Sergeant Frank Rizzo stepped out, a cane supporting his weight. His leg had healed enough for him to be assigned to light duty, and he had been sent back to the unit to oversee supply logistics from the rear. Seeing him, Ellie felt a cold fury rise within her. This man had tormented her, made her question her own worth, and it had all been based on a lie. She walked straight up to him, the photograph held tightly in her hand. "We need to talk, Sergeant," she said, her voice low and trembling with controlled anger. She led him to a quiet spot behind a supply tent, the snow crunching under their boots. Without a word, she handed him the photograph. He looked at the front, his expression unreadable. Then he turned it over and read the note. The color drained from his face. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "From the SS officer we captured yesterday," she said, her voice like ice. "The one whose men killed Jimmy. Now you're going to tell me what it means." "What does it mean, Rizzo?" "The weak link. What does that mean?" Rizzo leaned heavily on his cane, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had finally crushed him. "It means they had me," he said, his voice ragged. "It means they had me and I couldn't see a way out." The story tumbled out of him, a torrent of fear and regret. The German officer they had captured had been an intelligence agent, part of a spy ring operating in the United States long before Pearl Harbor. He had posed as a neutral military observer from Sweden, touring American bases. At Fort Benning, he had identified Rizzo as a potential asset, a man embittered by his experiences in North Africa, cynical about the war effort, and fiercely protective of his family back home. After the agent returned to Germany, Rizzo was contacted. They didn't ask him to betray his country, not at first. They simply used what they knew. They had information about his sister, who lived in a neighborhood with a large German-American population in Milwaukee. They implied that if he didn't cooperate, she and her children could be harmed. It was subtle, terrifying blackmail. They didn't want secrets, Rizzo confessed, his voice breaking. They didn't want me to steal plans. They just wanted me to be their man on the inside, to ensure my unit was inefficient, to slow things down, to make mistakes. And I played along. I fed them useless information, told them about fake supply shortages. I was trying to walk a tightrope, to protect my family without actually hurting my men. He looked at Ellie, his eyes pleading for understanding. Then you showed up. You were sharp, motivated, and a damn good mechanic. You made the unit stronger. I panicked. My German handlers would see that I wasn't having the negative effect they wanted. I was terrified they would think I was double-crossing them and go after my sister, so I tried to get rid of you. I had to make you look bad. I had to make you fail. I needed you gone so I could go back to being the weak link they thought I was. The ambush where he'd been wounded, he explained, had likely been a test of his loyalty, a way for the Germans to see how his unit would perform under pressure. By saving them all, Ellie had not only exposed the German agent, she had inadvertently saved Rizzo from his own trap. She had proven his unit was anything but weak. The truth was staggering. The injustice she had felt wasn't personal prejudice. It was the desperate, cruel act of a man caught in an impossible situation. Military intelligence interrogated the captured SS officer, and under pressure, he confirmed Rizzo's entire story. Rizzo was cleared of treason, but his deception meant his career in the army was over. He was to be honorably discharged. On his last day with the unit, he found Ellie in the motor pool working on a Jeep engine. He walked up to her, holding his cap in his hands. "Vance," he said, "I'm sorry for everything. What I did to you was wrong, no matter my reasons. You deserved better." He placed a folded piece of paper on the fender. "I've submitted my final report. It includes a full recommendation for you to receive the Silver Star for your actions at the ambush. It's the least I can do." He turned and walked away without another word. Months later, the war in Europe was over. Ellie was back on the ranch in Texas. The air was warm, smelling of dust and blue bonnets, a world away from the frozen mud of the Ardennes. She stood on her porch in her dress uniform one last time, the silver medal pinned neatly above her breast pocket. The mailman brought a letter. It was from Frank Rizzo. He was living in a small town in Pennsylvania, working in a local garage. His letter was short, but the words were clear. He apologized again properly this time, not for his fear, but for the pain it had caused her. He ended the letter with one final line. "We all misjudged you. The Germans thought you were a joke, and I let my fear make me treat you like one. But you were never a joke. You were one of Patton's best. You made them bleed. And in the end, you made us all proud." Ellie folded the letter and looked out at the vast, peaceful Texas sunset. Her journey was over. She had faced the fire of combat and the cold sting of injustice. She had fought for her country, for her brother's memory, and for her own place in a world that had tried to deny her one. She had earned her respect, uncovered a hidden truth, and found a strength within herself she never knew she possessed. The scars of the war would always be with her, but so would the unshakable knowledge that she had been tested, and she had not been found wanting.